Welcome. Thank you for joining us for part 4 of our 5-part training webinar series called Branding on a Budget, brought to you by United Way of Northern Utah. I'm Danielle and this is Haley. We are very excited for today's presentation on engaging diverse audiences. We also have an interview to share with you we conducted earlier this month with Stacy Bernal. She's the Ogden City Diversity Commissioner, published author, professional speaker. She was actually in a TedX talk, so we will put that in the chat box below for you. And she is the founder of Awesome Autistic Ogden. At the end of the training, after her interview, we will have a Q&A. So if you have any questions that pop up throughout the training, make sure you drop them in the chat box and we will address them at the end. Let's get started.
So we are going to kick off the training today by talking about DEI, another acronym. If you have watched our past trainings, you know that we are very passionate about acronyms. So we are going to be talking about DEI in the workplace, and that stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So before we really dive into what each of these pieces mean and how they work together, we're going to start off with some definitions. So diversity, when we're speaking about diversity in the workplace, it is the existence of variations of different characteristics in a group of people or having variety. And what do we mean when we say engaging diverse audiences in reference to the topic of today's training? So we are talking about audiences that are comprised of people from varying social and ethnic backgrounds, identities, sexual orientations, people with disabilities, etc. And then next we have equity. And sometimes equity can be confused with equality. I know, sometimes you hear those and you think that they're interchangeable in a way. So equality means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. But then equity within that recognizes that each person has different circumstances and then allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to achieve an equal outcome. So definitely have those definitions in mind. And then last but not least, inclusion. And that is the practice of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded and or marginalized. So when we're talking about inclusivity, something that you really want to keep in mind as we move forward in this training is the importance of inclusive language and what that means. And so when you're putting out materials on behalf of your organization, or if you're making presentations, if you're posting on social, on your website, things like that, making sure that you have those pieces and that you know your audience and you know who you're speaking to, and that you're not leaving them out in your messaging and in your wording and how you're presenting your organization. So I guess that goes back to your brand and knowing what your brand is and who you are as an organization or as a local business, and then making sure that you know your target audience, things like that, so that you know how to be inclusive when you're speaking to the community and the different populations. And Stacy talks a lot more about this in her interview coming up next, so definitely stay tuned for that. So now that you have the 3 pieces of DEI, I want to talk for a minute about what this means in the workplace. There are codes of conduct and there are pieces of professionalism, like not using profane language, things like that, that you have to do in certain workplaces. But those pieces should never impede on who a person is, and it shouldn't make someone feel like they can't be themselves when they come to work, or that they have to alter something about their identity when they walk through the door. So just really being mindful of DEI in the workplace and making sure that each of those elements, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are building on each other to really round out your work environment so that everyone feels welcome and safe being in that space and working alongside each other. And last but not least, when we're talking about DEI in the workplace, just make sure that you are doing the work. You're probably hearing all of these definitions and you're already thinking of things in your own nonprofit or your business that you could change, and just make sure that you're committed to doing the work and that there's an action item attached and that it's genuine and that you're not doing things for show. And that was actually something that we asked Stacy about in the interview that we're going to air next, and that she has a great answer for. So stick around for that.
I wanted to give us an opportunity to do something now, something you can do right now as nonprofit organizations, as small businesses. And if you already have it, that's great. Check in with it. There's always room for improvement. There's always room for growth. And that's a DEI statement. So a DEI statement addresses how your organization or business's values, policies, practices, and experiences advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace or in the project that you are continuously working on. So with a DEI statement, I have a really good example, and that's the Ford Foundation, and they call it their diversity, equity, and inclusion mission statement, and it's at the forefront of everything they do. It's on their website landing page, and it says, at the Ford Foundation, diversity, equity, and inclusion are at the core of who we are. Our commitment to these values is unwavering across all of our work around the world. They are central to our mission and to our impact. We know that having varied perspectives helps generate better ideas to solve the complex problems of a changing and increasingly diverse world. So the nice thing about a DEI statement is it can be internal for your membership, your staff, your committees that you're working with, but it can also be external. That can be at the forefront of increasing your recruitment policies. It can be at the forefront of how you get people to engage with your mission. And some of the action items that go along with that you could check in with is targeted outreach efforts, formal policies, and specific goals. And so this goes along with what Haley was saying about doing the work and making sure it's genuine. The next thing we're going to talk about is accessibility, which I think is something that is such an important part of DEI, but it's often overlooked as a part of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we want to make sure we're really focusing on accessibility in our organizations and our projects. And accessibility, the definition is the aspects which influence a person's ability to function within an environment. Is this easy to obtain, reach, understand, and so on? And this doesn't only mean physically accessible in terms of wheelchair ramps, braille signage, accessible bathrooms, etc., but also in the digital sphere. So we can be doing that now, even with our Zoom meetings. Ask yourself, is your information and your technology that you're using accessible to all? Is it compatible with assistive technology devices? Another thing to keep in mind of for everybody is people first language. So when you're talking about this accessibility piece, you want to make sure you're referring to people with disabilities, not disabled people. So it's people with disabilities because that's not their identity. And Stacy does talk more about this in her interview, and she gives a lot of awesome examples and resources. So that's kind of just a little coverage of that, but she'll talk more about it later.
So next we are going to talk a little bit more about implicit bias, and an implicit bias is an unconscious association, belief, or attitude toward any social group. So these biases can often lead to attributing qualities or characteristics exhibited by one particular person to a group at large, otherwise known as a stereotype. And you really want to keep in mind that when we're talking about implicit bias, we're talking about the things that are happening on an unconscious level. So things that you're doing and you're not aware that you're doing them, right? So it might not be as easy to recognize and to fix all the time. So you want to be mindful of these, especially as we are all in the nonprofit sphere or the local business sphere on this call. We are in the community. We are working with and for the community, and we can't do our work effectively if those roadblocks are in the way. So this is a very, very important piece when you're doing work in the community and with diverse populations and audiences every single day. So now that you know about implicit bias, and you might be sitting there realizing, oh, okay, I have XYZ, and you might be thinking of some examples from your own life, how do you manage these? And so these are just a couple things that you can try to implement in your day-to-day. And the first one is seeing people as individuals instead of falling into these stereotypes that we just talked about. So instead of using stereotypes to define people and make assumptions, really get to know your community, get to know your audience, and get to know them on a personal level and who they really are as people. And don't just make those generalizations or assumptions, even though that can be difficult to do sometimes. And if you recognize yourself responding to a person based off of a stereotype or an assumption, really work to change that. Again, do the work and make that conscious effort to alter that response. And then also reflect on your personal attitude and your personal reactions, and then adjust your perspective, put yourself in their shoes, try to look at things from a different lens. And last but not least, practice mindfulness and really being in control and aware of your thoughts and your feelings and your actions. And some common practices that often are done in regards to mindfulness are things like yoga or deep breathing exercises or meditation. So things like that can really help you ground yourself and stay mindful in your thoughts and actions and how you're interacting with others.
So why are we talking about DEI and then we're going to be jumping into public speaking? You might be asking why we decided to entitle this training Engaging Diverse Audiences. Well, we chose these two topics to go together because, well, first of all, Stacy was a TedX speaker and she's very passionate about DEI. She educated herself on diversity and inclusion so that she could educate others, which is incredible. That's like the definition of an agent of change in your community. And she also started her own nonprofit organization to support individuals with autism in the Ogden community. So that was an overlap that we had as soon as we knew Stacy was willing to be a presenter. But then we also started thinking about how a lot of the times when people are putting presentations together in public speaking, we lose some of that inclusive messaging along the way.
And then this leads directly into reaching out to diverse communities. So are you meeting people where they are, or are you expecting people to come to you? And I think this is another important piece. We keep touching back on how all of us are in the nonprofit sphere or local businesses. We are in the community. We are the community we're working for and with them. So are we out in that community and meeting people where they are? And that also includes messaging. Are we using heavy text jargon and things that people don't understand, and like specialty language that maybe you know from your field, but other people don't know the definitions to those words? So how can we kind of level the playing field and make sure that we're all understanding the information that's being presented? And then after you're reaching those diverse audiences, how are you engaging them? How are you making your public speaking efforts relevant and impactful for those who you are speaking to? I think a big piece of public speaking is making sure that the audience can see themselves in your presentation and in the information that you're giving them, and they have a reason to invest. So what's the why? I know we've talked about why statements in our past trainings, but what's the why in your public speaking, and how are people buying into what you're saying, and how are you meeting them where they are to engage them? And then last but not least, accessibility, especially if it's a public speaking event in person, or even like Danielle mentioned, Zoom webinars, things like that. Do you have captions for your video content, or do you have alternative text for your images? Do you have interpreters available? Do you have clear signage and directional signage available so that when people show up, they just know where to go? They know where the ramps are, the restrooms, concessions, this or that. Those things all help make a public speaking event, or just events in general, super impactful and accessible. And like Danielle mentioned, Stacy does speak a lot about this later, and she gives some great examples, so stick around to hear from her.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about public speaking. I know public speaking is a hard topic because some people either really love it or they really hate it. And I have to be honest, I personally love it, but hopefully these like quick tips that we're going to offer can be useful, especially for those of you that are a little bit more nervous, or maybe you're new to presenting. Just to kind of break down something I thought was really important that I found when I was doing a little bit of research is the Harvard Business Review says there's no way you can give a good talk or presentation unless you have something worth talking about. Conceptualizing and framing what you want to say is the most vital part of preparation, and I love this. And I'm actually going to throw the link to this article in the chat box because I found it really interesting. It's called How to Give a Killer Presentation, so definitely give that a read afterwards. one of the first things you need to think about when you're presenting is who your audience is. So before even crafting your presentation, keep in mind who you're presenting to and why this information is even pertinent to them, right? So what would they want to hear? How would they want to hear it? How do you think they would most, identify with the presentation? What is the energy or mood of the room, which is such a crucial piece? How can you make your information relatable or relevant to the work they're doing so that you can connect with them? And what are they passionate about? What do they want to hear about? Does this line up with what they're interested in?
And that's the perfect lead in. So once you know your audience, then you're going to start creating your content and creating your presentation. And so we kind of put together a little outline of something that could help you maybe when you're putting together a presentation, just things to think about. So you want to start with an introduction: who, what, where, when, why. Introduce yourself. You want to introduce what you're talking about, kind of where things are taking place, where you are, when things are happening, why, the why statement.
Bring it back.
Bring it back, tie everything together. But you want to give that overview, high-level perspective, and then try to be catchy and really set the tone and bring in the energy that you want your presentation to have. So if you get up on stage and you're very quiet and have your hands in your pockets, that's going to set a very different tone and expectation than if you're out there and you're like, hey everyone, I'm so-and-so, how are we all feeling today? So you really want to just make sure that you know the tone and that you are setting that tone so that you kind of have control of how that presentation goes. And then the body of your presentation, or the actual information that you are giving, the actual presentation itself, you want to make sure that that is engaging to your audience and that it's interactive for them. It's not putting people to sleep, that it's matching the tone and the vibe that you want to give off. So asking for audience participation or feedback or having fun interactive bits, and then even sharing stories, really impactful, powerful stories that can help as well in engaging your audience and helping them see themselves in the information that you are presenting. And then finally, you have your closeout, which is where you bring it all home and you wrap everything up, all of the ideas. Today we talked about blank as a recap, any follow-up questions or concerns, links for more information, that kind of stuff. Make sure that you're sharing those resources, social handles, websites, landing pages, things of that sort.
So there are essentially, I would say, about 3 ways to present a presentation, give a talk, anything like that. The first is to read it, right, off a script, a teleprompter, whatever, however fancy you want to get. The second is to have bullet points or kind of like a layout to map out what you want to say in each section and give yourself a little reminders, or to memorize it. So we'd love to know what your different presentational styles are. If you want to put it in the chat box, we can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A as well.
So next we're going to talk more about the visual aesthetics of your presentation and those important graphic pieces. So making sure that you have a visual aid is very helpful and engaging, especially when we're talking about accessibility. So do you have a slideshow, video, graphics, photos, things of that nature? And if you do have a slideshow, make sure it's not too wordy. Try to stick to your bullet points, your main talking points. And always remember that your visual aids are there to be a visual aid. They're there to aid and assist in your presenting, but you are the presenter and you're presenting that information. So make sure you're not reading off of your slides or you have your head turned back from the audience. Try to be as prepared as possible when you're giving presentations, but then it's also nice to have that imagery or those text pieces. And then some helpful programs, now that we're talking a little bit more about visual aids and putting together these projects and these presentations. You might be thinking, what? Where do I start? So just a couple off the top of our heads: the Canva, PowerPoint, Google Slides, Prezi, and then some of the Adobe suites. And like we always mention in these trainings, make sure to check for those nonprofit discounts, or some of them are even free for nonprofits. So definitely look into that because there are a lot of options out there.
Other helpful things, just a couple tips that we kind of talked about before we were putting this together, and we just want to close out with this. Be mindful of your body language. So if you're slumped or if you got your hands in your pockets
Me
or
right
your
now.
arms crossed, or if you're like really, really stiff, that's going to set a very different tone. Even if you're talking very vibrantly, and if your body is like, like this, it's not going to seem so exciting, and people are going to lose interest really quickly. It's important to have eye contact, but don't just like stare at one person. Make sure you're really like gauging your eye contact around the room, and you don't have to necessarily like look straight into their soul, but just kind of peep around as you go. Don't be too distracting with your hands. So for example, Haley speaks with her hands a lot, but she does it in a way that's very like, oh, okay, she's making a point. But some people, unless she gets very excited, some people, kind of like really get into it, and it can be very distracting. So definitely be mindful of that. Another thing on the other end is to consider that it is okay to pause. And sometimes when you're giving a long presentation, people want to get it all out. But if you have to take a second to like think about your next step, or if you have to take a second even just to catch your breath, you can get a drink. I always have to have a drink with me. Things like that. Just be mindful that it is okay. People are there to listen to you, but they also know that you're human and they're not going to expect it to be perfect. So just relax and just enjoy it. And lastly, to close out, I really want to share the best advice I've ever received, and it was from Kim Bauscher, who's the executive director of Ogden Downtown Alliance, where I used to work with Haley. We were going for my very first TV interview. I think it was, my first TV interview with Ogden Downtown Alliance, and I was a little nervous, and Kim goes, just pretend you're having coffee with a friend. And ever since she gave me that advice, I always give it to everybody else. So I just think that's a really valuable piece of advice that I hope you can all take with you, and it'll be helpful for you as well. So shout out, Kim. Thank you for that.
All right, everyone. So we are now at the end of our 4th training, and we have another action item for you. So with all of this talk of diversity and inclusion and engaging diverse audiences, the action item for today is to assess your own DEI statement. If your organization already has one, check in with that, make sure that you are doing the work, see if anything needs to be updated or changed. And if your organization or your business does not have one, then we challenge you to draft one to see what that would look like for your organization moving forward. And now we are going to head into our pre-recorded interview with Stacy. So make sure to drop any questions that you have right now or during that pre-recorded interview in the chat box below, so we can get into that in our live Q&A after, and she will be there with us. So we are so excited to have her now in the pre-recorded interview, but then also in the live Q&A at the end. So also wanted to mention really quick that following this training, we will be sending out an email with additional resources and links, and then a link to a survey. So please participate in that survey so that we can get your feedback and utilize it to better our future trainings. So thank you all for joining us.
Thanks. All right, we are here live in our own homes. We're very excited to be joined today by Stacy Bernal. And Stacy kind of does a little bit of everything in Ogden. Let's see. Are you an active Ogden City Diversity Commissioner?
I am. I was just voted into the vice chair position, replacing the incomparable Adrian Andrews. So I know.
That's going to be incredible, though. You'll do so great. Let's see. You're a published author. What's the name of your book? Do you want to share?
The book is The Things We Don't Talk About.
And what is that?
It's a memoir of hardships, healing, and hope. Let's see if oh, well, what do you know? I have one right behind me.
Oh, convenient.
So
got that. Beautiful.
Love it. Just kind of how we, the things that impact our lives and the ways that we're told to stay quiet, and my journey and talking about the things we don't talk about.
I love it. And I know it's been really well received, especially here in Ogden too, which is exciting. Yeah. And then you're an alumni of Weber State too, right?
I am.
Oh, there you go.
Also
So if
on
you're
the
on
board
here,
of
Allison,
directors.
from last week, we got another alumna. Professional speaker. I think that's the first time I ever met you, Stacy, was you were presenting at a Women in Business
Oh,
luncheon.
yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, who is that girl? And I was fangirling. And founder of Awesome Autistic Ogden, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I started that in 2018, and it was very just a small gathering. There were about 20 of us that gathered around 25th Street. And then into the next year, we spent a lot more time organizing and had a really big event up at Weber State. And then in 2020, we had to cancel, but we just wrapped up this year's, which was amazing. We did stuff throughout the whole month of April because April is Autism Appreciation Month. And really, it's my passion project because of my 15-year-old who is autistic, and just trying to gain, I say awareness, but I feel like people are pretty aware of autism. So it's extending that and getting people to appreciate people who are different and recognizing neurodiversity. And anyway, so yeah, that's my baby is my Awesome Autistic Ogden.
That's amazing. Is there anything else? Am I missing anything of all the list of things that you do?
I'm an ambassador for the Ogden Marathon. So
Oh,
although
okay.
by the time this airs, the virtual marathon will have already taken place. But yeah, I'm really involved with the Goal Foundation. And
Amazing. And next month we actually have Clarice Miljor from Goal Foundation joining us. So that's a fun connection.
Yeah.
Okay, well, awesome. Well, let's go ahead and get started. What are some of your, to go off of all of the things that you're doing, what are some of your favorite projects that you're working on right now?
Perfect segue. So yeah, like I said, Awesome Autistic Ogden is a big one that, although it's typically an April event, I do want it to be more of a year-round conversation because autism is a forever thing. It's, once kids are diagnosed, they grow into autistic adults. And once they age out of school, so they can stay in the public school system until they're 21. Beyond that, they're kind of on their own. So I actually, Governor Cox just recently announced Autism After 21 initiative. And I am so fortunate I'm getting involved with that. So it's going to be a 3-year research plan at this point where we're looking at the whole state. We're looking at what resources we have as far as employment and housing for autistic adults. So I'm getting involved in that project, which I'm stoked about. And as a commissioner with the Diversity Commission, we have a lot of conversations with Ogden Police, and especially with things that have been happening in the last year. So we're actively involved with conversations about, well, especially now with autism, because Utah just passed legislation that all law enforcement be trained in autism training. So I reached out to Chief Young last week, and we're going to start a conversation about that and see how I can help with their training and be involved in that. So yeah, those are just a couple.
That's amazing. I didn't know about that new law. That's incredible. And that, I feel like that's right up your alley, and you'll be able to be an absolute asset to them as they're working on that program. So that's awesome.
I know, I'm excited.
So you mentioned a little bit in the intro, Awesome Autistic Ogden. So what led you to start that, and how did that come to be?
In 2018, I was scrolling Facebook, as I'm known to do, and it was actually the end of March, and I saw that there were autism events planned throughout the state, but there wasn't anything in Ogden. And I don't know who put on those events. I don't know who was in charge of it, but I was just like, man, why don't we have something like that here? And I was talking to a friend who also has an autistic daughter, and she said, well, why don't you do something? And I'm like, I guess so. So I just put it out on Facebook and said, hey, if anyone wants to come, April 2nd, we'll be at the corner of Washington and 25th, and come on down. And so, like I said, like 20 people showed up, and it was super, I mean, it was not special. Like someone from the Standard came out and they were kind of like, well, nothing to see here. So it just was this small idea, but just because no one else in the community was doing it. And I wanted to help create that place where we celebrate these kids who are different, because in a lot of ways they are overlooked. They miss out on a lot of the normal things that kids have. They don't have those milestones. So what can we create in this community that is for them, specifically for them? So yeah.
And I love that you mentioned them possibly feeling overlooked or forgotten in those pieces. So what are some things that we as communications professionals can do to be more mindful and adaptive, like in including or reaching people with disabilities?
That's such a great question. And because there are so many differences, so if we're talking about autism specifically, for example, a lot of autistic people have sensory overwhelm. So it could be that an environment might be too loud for them. So are there noise canceling headphones available? Is there a place, like if they're in a setting where, again, if it's really loud, is there a place where they can go and be in a quieter spot? Because these are things like we never knew. Like, when we got the diagnosis when he was 3, all of a sudden there's no manual. And so we're just trying to figure stuff out. And so I would take him places and I would have no idea how badly it would end up. I couldn't foresee that trying to go to a basketball game at Weber State, that the voice of the announcer, he told me it sounds like bullets are ricocheting in my brain, because that's how loud it sounded to him. And so we ended up not being able to go inside to watch the basketball game. And then I tried again, like a few weeks later, with noise canceling headphones. And then the headphones were too hot and they were making his ears itch. And so we just kind of have to figure it out. But I think, if organizations can make an effort to at least have some accommodations in place, but that's just one example.
Moreover, on inclusivity, I know you personally, but I know that you've done a lot of research and trainings on inclusivity and diversity and managing implicit bias trainings. Could you share kind of like a brief overview, some key takeaways, or maybe like some links that we can go to learn some more?
Absolutely. In fact, I have a PDF that I created that I use when I do diversity training. So I'm happy to make that available to you and to all the attendees. But what I created in this little document is just an overall generalization of what implicit bias is, and then, how it manifests and, kind of what it looks like. So there's that recap. And then I've got a list of resources, a ton of, books, documentaries, tests that you can go online and take, and different trainings that you can go on free. Everything is free. But yeah, I'm happy to make that PDF available, because I think that it can be overwhelming. And I think that sometimes people are kind of afraid to confront these things. Especially when we even say the word diversity. And I don't think I realized that was such a touchy word. And I don't know that it necessarily was before, but I think, again, in this last year, when I just see that there's a stigma attached to the word. So yeah, and overall, when I do my training, I tell people implicit biases are the thoughts we don't think we think. We just don't realize. And it's a much deeper conversation than that. But one of the really, I hope this is powerful, is that when I go into presentations, I do a privilege test. I have the audience members think about, will read a statement, and I want you to think about, how does this apply to me? So for example, if I am going to an event, do I have to worry about accommodations being made for me? Things that is a privilege. Being able-bodied, that is a privilege that you are afforded. And so I like to get people thinking about, yeah, I take the things that I take for granted that are a struggle for other people and negatively impact them, but it doesn't mean anything to me. I don't have to think about it.
We can drop some links in the chat right now. And then also in our follow-up email, we can include some additional resources in those lists that you've made. So we really appreciate you sharing those with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think we touched a little bit earlier on your work with the Diversity Commission. Did you learn anything in your time doing that, working with them, about reaching out to diverse communities that you could share with the group? Just anything overall?
Absolutely. One of the first things that, again, stuff I didn't have to think about. So even as we're talking about how we're communicating with people in the community, the first topic that came up was, not everyone has internet. Not everyone, is online. And so if we're saying, oh, we're sharing everything on our website, or we've got it on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, well, what portion of our audience will never ever see that because they don't have access? Or they, do they have the technology? Not everyone has a smartphone. So we have to be cognizant and be thinking about that. Are we offering things in other languages than English? Who is our audience, and what information do they need, and how are we disseminating it to them? And if it's getting out to them, but then there's the language barrier, it's pretty ineffective. So it was things like that that we were thinking about. And, even talking about, they talk about print is dead and people throw away their mail. Well, we know that's not true, because again, we know that there's a lot of people who, if they're not accessing things online, they do look forward to the mail. They do look forward to getting those pieces. And so we've just had to be really mindful about how we are communicating with everyone in the community.
And then do you have any additional tips to what you already just mentioned about how to engage those diverse audiences that we should be including in our marketing and communications plans as nonprofit organizations or local businesses?
Yeah, as nonprofits, we really have to pay attention to how we're communicating, what we're communicating, and if we are communicating, again, correctly to our intended audience.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I've talked to some of the other different nonprofits in the community, and that's what they say is, well, how do we reach more diverse people? And, in particular, I was talking to one of the local nonprofits, and they're like, we want to get a board. We want people on our board who are more diverse and, who do have different backgrounds, but we are coming up against these challenges. And so how do we overcome those? So you have to get creative. If you're always looking for the same type of people, or if you're asking your current board to find people that they know, well, they usually know people who are socioeconomically similar to them. They probably live in the same neighborhoods and kind of come from the same background. So yeah, you got to get out of that. You kind of get out of your comfort zones and get into some spaces to find the people. And then the question becomes, well, then are we tokenizing them? Are we only, bringing in these diverse voices to fill a quota? Well, what's your end goal? And in a lot of ways, I'll be honest, I get invited to serve on boards, and I often think that like they probably need more women. They probably, want a minority perspective. But if I've got the time and the passion, then I'm willing to do that. So, that's something that nonprofits need to be getting, especially the people that they're serving. They should have someone representative of that demographic on their board that's telling them, serving as that liaison between the nonprofit and the people they're serving. So, yeah.
You mentioned about having like a token diversity piece. And I know this is kind of sometimes a touchy subject, but I guess what I would like to know is if you could share some advice on making sure that our nonprofit diversity efforts are genuine and not for show, because I do feel like, especially this year, there's been a lot of prominent voices that are, claiming that they're inclusive or diverse, and they, by putting a person of color in like an ad or, and sometimes it can come off as like, well, what are you actually doing as an organization to make that change, make that impact, or like really have that voice? And so I was just wondering if you could speak on that a little bit.
Absolutely. And you bring up a good point that I think we do want to show that we're making an effort. But if that's all it is, if we're just putting on a show, or it's virtue signaling, like, oh yeah, we do care about these things, you have to back it up and you have to do the work. And the fact of the matter is, like, I feel like right now, in a lot of ways, we're just starting to scratch the surface, which is so surprising to me. It's 2021. And it's like, what has been happening all this other time that we're just now really focusing on these things? But really, everything has to start from the top, and it has to start with leadership. And I talk about how the people in the positions of power, they are ultimately the ones who are going to help get change going. And change is hard and change is painful. And in a lot of ways, there's resistance, and they're not all like ready to jump on board and get into it. So it's got to start with leadership at the top. And if they say this matters, we really, we value diversity, we really want to make these things happen, then they have to back it up and they have to do it. But they can't put all that responsibility on the the minorities, the marginalized voices, that they have to like really be willing to do the work.
What are some strategies that we as small businesses and nonprofit organizations can implement to become more authentic and educated on these topics that will help improve our diversity efforts and our relationships with the community?
I think, well, and I know this has been something I've done personally that's really helped me, is I started following diverse content creators and influencers because I don't know, and I will never know what it's like to be an autistic person. So I follow a lot of autistic adults. Same with the LGBTQ community, with all these different groups, because I know my perspective as a parent to a neurodiverse person and as a biracial woman. I can bring that with me all day, every day, and authentically own this space. But I want to be a good advocate and ally for all these other groups. So I follow them. I want to understand, what are their issues? What can I do in my position of power to help those? And so it's, understanding and respecting where they're coming from and helping to elevate. So part of that is, even when I do training and if I refer certain books, there are some great books by white authors about these topics, but I try to refer Black writers. Those are the voices that I'm trying to elevate, because we need to have their firsthand perspective.
You mentioned earlier being in tune with your demographic, right? Having things available in multiple languages if needed. People may not have access to internet, et cetera. So how can we, as business owners and nonprofit directors or members of nonprofit organizations, be mindful of our target demographics and communities to make sure that they are receiving the correct information and content that is relevant to them?
So as an example, we've got this stuff going on with the Marshall White Center, and we've probably got people on the call today who are involved in those conversations. They've been doing their research for what they're going to be doing for the new, moving forward with the Marshall White Center. So first they did this huge survey that was open to everyone. And they were just like, yeah, we want like everyone of Ogden to be coming on and giving input. But a lot of people who were taking that survey, they don't necessarily even use the Marshall White Center. They don't live in the neighborhoods that are right by the Marshall White Center. So they took that, first big initial survey and they, whittled it down, got the information they needed from it. But then they were doing boots on the ground, knocking on doors and going to all of the people in that area around the Marshall White Center who truly were impacted and who would truly, they really needed their perspectives and their say. So that was something that that committee, they went out and did. And I think, for any organization that is, again, serving these different populations, it might be a matter of, that's what you have to do, is go straight to the neighborhoods and the homes and find it directly from those people.
What are some beginner level practices that our listeners can start working on today to improve their inclusivity?
The first thing is that if you have any interest in, I guess, these social justice issues, I can't think of what other way to term it. I mean, that's really the first question, is, do you care? Do you care about it? Because I did a diversity training to a group of leaders in our community. And one of the men said to me, I think diversity is stupid. And I think this is, I don't understand why we even have to be having these conversations. And that hurt me to my core, because I thought, no matter what I say to this person, and he is in a high level position in his career, which means he impacts people much lower than him and will for years to come. And he doesn't care about the conversation. So you have to care about it, and you have to value why inclusivity matters and why we want to have different voices and perspectives at the table. So as an example, I was talking to someone about Americans with Disabilities Act, so the ADA. Do you know who instigated that? Who was fighting for those rights for disabled people? It was not able-bodied people. It was the disabled people. And so there's a great documentary called Crip Camp that I tell everyone, watch this documentary, but it's about these people who were in their wheelchairs and they couldn't get up a sidewalk. They couldn't, move about the city in any way that, really worked for them. And they were the ones who were going to Washington, D.C., and they were the ones saying, we need this. And they were the ones who made it happen. So that's why we now today have the little divots in sidewalks that are wheelchair accessible. So we need to be having these conversations that include the people who are being overlooked.
Before we move on we wanted to ask you a few questions about public speaking as well, but before we move on from this conversation, is there anything else that you want to add or anything that you want like our viewers to know regarding inclusivity and diversity in Ogden?
I love Ogden. I think that, I've been here now for 12 years, and we have such a great community. But I want people to understand, like, our school district is currently over 50% Hispanic. Our demographics, I think we're about 35% Hispanic right now. And I want people to look around, look at our school boards, look really anywhere in the county, in our city, and ask yourself, do the people in the leadership positions represent the demographics of Ogden? And in a lot of them, I think that you will see that that is not the case. And that's why I have kind of made this my life's mission of opening up that space. I want to see more Hispanic people being represented in spaces where they should be. I want to see LGBTQ people. I want to see disabled people, women. Like, we all deserve a seat at the table.
So kind of to segue now, I know Danielle just mentioned we wanted to get into public speaking. So as a public speaker, and we are planning to drop your TEDx talk in the chat below so that everyone can enjoy it. So as a public speaker, what are some tips that you can share with the group about presenting to large audiences that are made up of all different types of people and just having to be engaging? Like, what kinds of tips can you offer for those scenarios?
The first thing I will say, and not to be negative right out the gate, but I want to be very real and honest and just remind everyone, wherever you go and wherever you're speaking, wherever you're connecting, you will never, ever engage with 100% of the people 100% of the time. And I know this to my core, and yet I still go in, and we all want to be loved, and we all want to be like the best, like, oh yeah, Stacy, she's the best. Of course I want that. But we all want that. And I want that for y'all too. But realistically, it's just not going to happen. And so but I still want people to be authentic to who you are. Mm-hmm. Be willing to be like, you know what, but literally this is me. And I'm not going to try to misshape myself into something else to be more appealing or to be more of something, whatever else other people or society they think I should be. So I just tell people, like, first and foremost, just be your brave, bold, authentic self, and you're going to have a good chunk of people who love you and adore you and worship you. And you're going to have a good chunk of people who are like, she's not for me. And that's okay. So be okay with that. But I'd also really I think body language is very important for people to be cognizant of that, and to learn that even culturally and with different audiences, we have to be really careful with how we're moving our bodies, because it could be misinterpreted in certain ways. So yeah, having a general understanding of communication and who your audience is. And I've had total flops and fails, and I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm sure I'll be watching myself on this going, I said, and so the nervous filler words, right? We all have them. Practice your nervous filler words. Mine's and so.
As a lot of communications professionals end up doing a lot of trainings and workplace presentations, do you have any quick and easy tips that we can carry over to those presentations?
Yeah, for the workplace presentations, I think the number one thing I tell people is don't do death by PowerPoint. So if you are using PowerPoint presentations, do not write like full paragraphs on a page, because then they're reading it and they're not listening to you and they're not paying attention. So your PowerPoint is going to be there to complement your presentation, but not for your attendees to be reading. So, and just like, I like to use like a visual and I'll kind of either, tell a story or make a point to go with that visual, but I try not to be too wordy. That's one of my suggestions. I know it's hard because people are like, well, what if you've got like money or pie charts and numbers and this and that. I'm like, well, obviously, if you have to have those on there, do that, but you don't have to write your entire presentation on a slide. So, those kinds of things. And again, paying attention to body language. It's so uncomfortable. And I know we all have these unconscious, like we don't even realize, oh my God, I do this thing with my face or my hands but when you watch people and they've got like their hands in their pockets, and there's body language research that shows you, if you aren't showing your hands, it shows that you're scared, that you're uncomfortable, that you're nervous. And I'll watch people and they'll just have their hands in their pockets the whole time. And I'm like, oh, take your hands out of your pockets. So that kind of thing.
Do you have any further advice overall that you'd like to share? Any resources or opportunities coming up for us to get involved?
For like around diversity or speaking or all of the above?
All of the above, Stacy, all of the above. You're like the go-to point for happenings.
I know. So back to being the vice chair of the Diversity Commission, I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little scared about that. I'm a little nervous about that. If nervous and excited kind of equal the same thing. That's where I'm at. We've been doing community conversations. Adrian has done a really good job of doing that, and we will continue doing those. And since we have new leadership, because Jeremy Shinoda is now the chair, we've got a lot of ideas and things that we want to be doing. And obviously we haven't been able to do in-person things, but when we are getting back to that point, we really want community involvement. And I know, I've only been a commissioner for a year now, and I talk to people all the time who didn't even realize that we existed. They're like, what's the Diversity Commission? So we really want to be building more even just awareness in the community that we exist. And then we want to create collaborative networking. We want community members to feel like they can come to us, that we are going to be this liaison to administration, that things that they're concerned about, we're concerned about, because we're not elected officials. We're volunteering in these capacities, and we all care about the community and want to be, representative again for the people who aren't necessarily being represented. So I plan on kind of being this loud vocal person on the commission. So I would love, the community, follow our Facebook page and get involved and just, share your perspectives. Tell us what we can be doing as commissioners to help make Ogden better for everyone.
Well, congratulations on your new position. I know you're going to do a lot of good, and yes, everybody follow Stacy along.
Thank you again so much for joining us and for answering our questions. And I know right now, if you're watching, we are going to move into our live Q&A, and Stacy will be joining us for that. So if you have any final thoughts or questions for her or for Danielle or myself, please drop those in the chat box below, and we will see you in a few. So thank you again, Stacy, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Hello, how are you doing, Stacy?
Hey, I told you I was going to be watching myself back and catching, and I'm sure everyone else caught this too, but I say, I said I didn't count, but oh my gosh. So I apologize to everyone.
Everybody has a word. Mine's like, unfortunately. So that comes out like quite often. No, you are just fine. You're wonderful. And we have quite a few questions too. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. First, I wanted to start. I know we actually did your interview quite a bit earlier in the month, and I've seen you a few times since then. And you mentioned, you had a lot of thoughts and stuff. So is there anything that you've kind of thought of since then that you'd like to share as well that might be helpful information for our viewers?
Oh, the phrase, okay, Wendy, I'm going to tell you real quick before I answer that question. So it says, what does it say? If you embrace diversity but ignore disability, you're doing it wrong. I think that is something that when we hear that word diversity, so like I said, there's a lot of some stigma with the word, and people automatically think we're going to talk about race issues, and there's so much more to diversity, and especially being the mother of a disabled neurodiverse person, that's huge for me. So if you embrace diversity but ignore disability, you're doing it wrong.
So thanks for asking, Wendy. And what I had thought of that I had kind of forgotten when we are talking about what we're doing with social media, and just to be cognizant of who the person is on the other end that might be excluded, because something I hadn't thought about, and again, because I follow a lot of disabled creators, someone was talking about how Clubhouse is the new platform. Everyone's going to Clubhouse and Clubhouse is so great. And this woman said, unless you're hearing impaired. And of course I was like, oh yes, that completely excludes a certain demographic. So, just think about, if you are trying to engage with certain people, what communication barriers might be there with those different mediums. So I wanted to make sure I shared that right out the gate.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I like that. That's a good point. So Angel's asking, can you share about a meaningful change you saw in company culture after a diversity training?
Thanks, Angel. This is a great question. And honestly, these conversations and trainings, a lot of it depends on the group dynamics. So like the one I referenced earlier, in that particular group dynamic, there wasn't much diversity. And so that one there was some friction and there was some discomfort. The one I did most recently, I did in a room where we had several out LGBTQ people, and one of them was a Black man, a gay Black man. And, we did this hour-long training. It was for realtors. And I'm talking about redlining. I'm talking about the history of discrimination in real estate, which I felt was, very powerful, and they should all, but the most powerful part of that presentation was when I finished and I said, any questions or stories? And this gay Black man stood up and he talked about his experiences and talked about living in diverse places like Texas and Georgia, but how Cache Valley, Utah was the most racist place he's ever lived. And that was so powerful. And so many people in that room were like, we had no idea, we had, and so I think when you can have a really impactful conversation like that, and when at least one person in the room can say, this has been my experience and this is my reality, and everyone else can say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. So yeah, it just kind of depends on that group dynamic of the room.
I like that you ask for people's experiences too, to help aid the conversation. I think that's so important.
Yeah.
And she has kind of a follow-up. How do you handle folks in a training who might be triggered by some of the things that you're talking about during the training?
That's a great question too. And triggers are an interesting topic, because how do you control other triggers? Because some of the name of my book is The Things We Don't Talk About. So I'm sure I have lots of triggers in that book, and it depends on kind of where people are kind of emotionally, and whether or not they're ready to hear these things. And with speaking on diversity, I do try to make sure like it's a safe space, and that I tell them, I'm not going to judge you. I can't speak for anyone else in the room, but I'm not here to judge you, but we are going to have some uncomfortable conversations. So I set that tone and I set that expectation. So, what we're talking about, realities and perspectives of other people that you've never even had to consider, that have never, come into your life. So yes, it might be triggering to you, but what does that mean? Like, the way it's making you feel and the emotions that are coming up, then there's probably something there for you that you need to dig a little deeper and think about why is it making you feel that way? So yeah, triggers are a hard one, because I think just depending where people are, they're sometimes not ready to confront these feelings.
That's a great point. Abby was asking, what are some suggestions for creating a DEI statement from scratch? And kind of some of the things that we talked about that we had kind of thought of just was like really checking in with yourself and with your team. And like you said, what is important to you? What do you care about? What are some things you want to improve on? Like listing out what trainings you want to do throughout the year, like being very mindful of where you're at and what areas need improvement, and bringing in somebody like Stacy to help your organization kind of, figure that out and get it down to a statement that will reflect how your organization wants to move forward and empower both your employees and who your organization is serving. And I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, but.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's really like what matters to you, what's important, and are you really willing to do the work that whatever those words are that you decide to make your mission, are you really willing to live up to those words?
Angel had another question. Can you touch on racist versus anti-racist and perhaps offer some tools for folks on this call to have those conversations with their family, friends, and or coworkers?
Yeah, racism is another one of those words, right? It's very, we get very upset if we are told something we said or did was racist. And, I'm not racist, and we're defensive. We don't want to think that we are part of the problem. And so the difference between really being racist and being anti-racist is being racist, we very quickly think this is KKK, this is I'm wearing a white hood, and it's not. It can be very kind of accidental. I didn't realize I was doing this thing or saying this thing. So being anti-racist means I'm consciously fighting to not be accidentally complicit. I'm doing everything. I'm so Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I think that's a great starting place to read that book, to look at, examine our own, because I can openly admit I have absolutely said and done racist things. I absolutely have. I grew up in the South. I had Black friends. I still like look back at things that I have said and done, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that was racist. Did I know at the time? And would I have called myself racist? No. But now that I know better, I can see that I did. And so I think that, we have to take ourselves out of it and not jump to immediately being defensive, and that we benefit. I mean, our country was structurally built to benefit, white men. And so now when we talk about unpacking things and rebuilding, the systems and the foundations, yeah, it's fighting to overcome that. So, and I'm sure Angel, I know she's got lots of good advice on this topic too.
She actually just was asking, how can folks book you for a training for their organization or business?
Yeah, I am so easy to find. I've got my website. I'm on all the socials. I will accept carrier pigeons. Yeah, whatever.
Love the accessibility.
I'm highly accessible.
I love that for you.
Yeah.
Let's see. So Sarah was asking, do you have any advice on how to start the conversation with individuals like the one you mentioned that don't care about diversity or might feel threatened by it because they are a white male in a certain tax bracket, to quote who you've been talking about in your interview. And then she said she can always catch up with you later. She had to head out, but I think that we would still love to hear your answer.
Sarah was at that training, so she does know.
Okay.
She knows who that person was and how that conversation went down. My first bit of advice is that you have to pick your battles, because, for example, I don't engage with people online. That is something that a year ago, I started getting attacked on a Facebook post. And for me, and especially if it's someone who, if we are strangers, and if I have no reason to have I don't have the emotional bandwidth. And so that's my first word of advice is you need to decide how much this matters. And if this person, if you feel like you can make any sort of difference. So one of the books I highly recommend is a book called The Person You Mean to Be. And the author, Dolly, it's Chughh is her last name. So I know I'm going to mispronounce it if I say it, but she talks about when we're having these conversations that there's this research that's been done that shows when you're engaging with people that 20% of the people are already on board with you and they agree with you. And 20% of the people you're never ever going to sway. Nothing you say, and we see this now, right? We see this with this very politically divisive last year we've had. But 60% of the people, there are 60% of the people who they are the ones that you might be able to sway. They might be able to come to a point where, you might still have political differences or whatever else, but you can find some commonality. And those are the people that are worth the effort that you can, engage. So be prepared for discomfort. And right off the bat, just decide whether or not it's someone that, so in that particular instance with that man, I knew that nothing I said was going to move the needle with him. And it's unfortunate, but I think he maybe learned a lot that day, and I don't think he'll do anything with it. So there's more people out there who will. So they're the ones that I find, the ones who can help move the needle.
And there are things after we talked and stuff too that we kind of talked about with the implicit biases, that there's also like microaggressions and things that might not be as verbal, but they still could be, hard to kind of manage. And even if it's like a friend or something, like how do you, I guess this is a question that I have, how do you like call them out on it without being too aggressive, I guess?
Yeah. So there's I don't know if I have the link for it in my PDF, but I can add it. But there's a bunch of articles about how do you handle microaggressions. And again, that comes down to comfort level. Are you willing to call them out if it's happening to you, if it's happening to someone and you see it happening? Like, what's your comfort level? Because we're talking about power struggles. We're talking about, I recognize my place as a minority woman, and that in certain rooms, what's the power dynamic, and am I comfortable enough? And honestly, like, there are things that happened to me 10 years ago that I never would have said something, and the Stacy today is like, oh no, like, hold my earrings, right? You have to decide where you're at, where your comfort level is, how much you're willing to engage. And microaggressions they're so hard. I have these conversations with people all the time, and I will share an experience I had this thing happen at a nail parlor, a nail salon, where this guy, he thought, and I was literally in the middle of getting my nails done, and he's like, I thought you worked here. And that was a very weird thing for a white man to say to me in a nail salon while I was getting my nails done. And I shared that experience, and people are like, well, why were you offended? Do you think you're too good to work in a nail salon? And I'm like, okay, this was a microaggression against me as a half Asian person, but now I'm sharing this story, and now you're taking it that I'm sick. So it was a very interesting, just to see how people react to what you can perceive as a microaggression. So
I think too, it's so important. Like you just mentioned, you brought up a really good point. I'm actually in a conflict class right now at Weber State, and they kind of talked about this, is when people bring up their feelings or their emotions, or they share a personal story with them, not to say that that's, you have to validate that there, it's not to be argued. That's what happened. That was their experience, whether it was meant that way or not. That's how they interpreted it. And that's how they're going to go home with that feeling or with that experience. And so to be an ally and to be a support is so important.
yeah.
Well, Stacey, it's been so good talking to you. I know we're like pretty over our time here, but I think we just had a lot of questions. A lot of people really interested in what you had to say, and we just really appreciate your time. And
I appreciate you for all the hard work that you've done in creating this series. You've done such a great job, and really, really glad to have had the opportunity. And for everyone who stayed on today, I appreciate you all being here.
We appreciate you, and we appreciate everyone that joined us as well. We hope to see you again at our last one next month, which is craziness. It's going to be with Clarice from the Goal Foundation, which will be a lot of fun. And we hope you'll join us.